morning, and welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is about reparations. It's about the reparation bills, proposals, and feasibility studies that sprang up right after the death of George Floyd. And it started with a small town called Evanston in Illinois, where the city council came up with a proposal of $25,000 to every Black resident, help make amends for past discrimination towards Black people in that city. And out of that, you also started hearing about states like California, which has also commissioned studies on this issue. But they are yet to come up with their report. I think it's supposed to come out in a couple of months or so from now. But the city of San Francisco came out with its proposal about a month ago. And in their proposal, the city decided to award every Black resident of San Francisco about $5 million. $5 million to every Black resident going back to like the 40s and who have lived in the city for over 10 years or something like that. And out of that proposal came a rejection by the NAACP of San Francisco. The NAACP of San Francisco rejected that proposal outright, and that drew a lot of rebuke and anger from Black people all over the country. So the NAACP had to come back and retract its own rejection by saying that they did not reject the $5 million proposal, but rather they wanted the city also to have, in addition to the $5 million proposal, to have development programs within the Black communities within the city. But by then, the damage has already been done. So people were very angry at the NAACP for rejecting that $5 million proposal. But anyway, the San Francisco City Council itself said that even though they agree with the proposal, they are still looking into it, whether they can afford to dole out the $5 million, which will come in the form of about $90-something thousand a year for every Black resident, for past discrimination acts by the city as well as the federal government and the state towards African American citizens going back in the late 40s with housing discrimination laws and all that stuff that was sanctioned by the federal government, state government, as well as the city government. But there was one thing that really drew me to this issue, which was basically about the polls and service that was done with regards to the issue of reparations for African Americans. And this poll showed that about 70% of Americans were staunchly against reparations for African Americans. And looking at the poll, most of these respondents were mainly whites. And there was one particular argument most of these people make in that poll. And the argument is that their ancestors who migrated into this country maybe in the late 19th century and the early 20th century did not have anything to do with slavery. Therefore, they don't own slaves and did not participate in slavery. And for them to be asked to repair the old damage that slavery did to African Americans and their ancestors in America is not fair to them. So basically, the argument is that since our ancestors who migrated later, which is after the abolition of slavery in America, all the way to this time, since they did not participate in that evil act, we don't have to be held responsible for what our ancestors and what we haven't done to anybody. And it sounds like it's a fair argument to be made by these people. But these people are not looking at the benefits of slavery that their ancestors got, as well as they themselves are benefiting right now today in America. Because to make that argument, to me, is a very shallow argument. It's a very, very, very shallow argument. Because the issue of slavery is not about those who partook in slavery in the 16th, 17th, or 18th century. It is the benefits that every person who lives in America today is getting from that toil that the African slave, the foundation that basically built this country into what it is today. And that is what these people have to be educated to understand. That the issue of reparations is not because your ancestors who migrated from Northern Europe or Western Europe in the late 19th century and early 20th century did not partake in slavery. It's about the benefits, the foundation that lay ground to what America is today, that we all benefit today, was at the toil and the hands of the African slave. It was the African slaves that built this country. And that is what most of these people have to understand. If not for the African slaves' free, cheap labor, America will not be what it is today, period. There's no ifs and buts about it. America, as you see today, the wealthiest country on earth today, came about because of the African slave. If the European, when they first came to this country, could have built this country without the need of African slave, they would have done it. They wouldn't have to come to Africa in search of slaves to come build this country. They would have done it. They would never have come to Africa if they could have done it. But because they couldn't do it, that is why they needed the people who could do it for them. And that was the African slaves. So these people coming up with this notion that, oh, because my ancestors migrated later after the abolition of slavery, we don't have to be responsible for reparations, for the past evil acts that was done to African American ancestors. I'm sorry, fellows. Yes, your ancestors might not have partook in the slavery trade. But you know what? Your ancestors benefited every bit of that slavery foundation that was set by this country. Because if not for that, this country will not be what it is today. That all of you, whether you're a current immigrant or you migrated 50 or 100 years ago, everybody living in this country today have benefited from the toil of the African slave in America. Period. There's no ifs and buts about it. You can never talk about how great America is today without the African slave. Because it was the African slave that gave the foundation of the successes of America today. It's that simple. So when you hear these people talking about all that, now, most of these later arrival Europeans that some of these people claim their ancestors came from what? Italy, Scandinavia, all that stuff. When they came to this country in the late 1800s and early 1900s, America gave them so much that the African American did not have in this country. The African Americans were still being treated as second-class citizens. They were still under segregation laws. The African American did not have the benefits of housing, loans from the federal government, state government, and all that stuff. But your later arrival ancestors had the benefits of all of that. Whilst the people whose ancestors built this country didn't have any of that benefits. So I don't want to hear this talk about my ancestors did not partake in slavery and all that nonsense. At the end of the day, when they even came here late, they had more benefits than the ancestors of the African American slaves in this country. They were not segregated against. They were not discriminated against. Because they were whites, they still enjoyed every full benefit of the foundation that has been set by the African slave. While the African slaves' children, descendants, were still being treated second-class citizens in this country. And that is what it is. So you people talking about where my ancestors came here late time and late and all that stuff, get that into your heads. Yes, they might have come here late, just like you also came here late. But you were given more benefits, you have benefited from it, than the ancestors or the descendants of the African slave. You have benefited way more than the descendants of African slaves. And up to this day, you still get more than the Africans, descendants of the African slaves. So when we're talking about reparations, yes, it needs to be there for the African slaves' children, because at the end of the day, it is them that set the motion for America to be a great country on this planet today. If not for the African slave, America would never have been what it is today. I mean, look at it. I don't know if you guys know ahead of the Homestead Act, the 1862 Homestead Act. The 1862 Homestead Act that came into existence around 1863 was basically gave land in the West, Minnesota, Midwest and West, Iowa, Wisconsin, all those places, to offer newly citizens, Americans, white American citizens, as well as even some newly arrival Europeans from Scandinavia. And they were given over 165 acres a piece of anybody who is an American citizen who also happens to be 21 years or head of a household. They were given this land, even though this was supposed to be given to every American citizens. And there might be one or two African Americans who might have who were free at that time, who might have gotten some land at that time. But most of them did not get the benefits to have access to these programs at that time. But they were given to whites. So, I mean, if you're talking about the issue of reparations, and when I hear opposition coming from even some liberal groups as well as conservatives talking about, oh, what are we? Why are we giving reparations to African Americans? I see like the term reparations has become a taboo to the extent that they don't want to hear it. But I think we have to sell this term for them to understand. People have to be educated to understand that the reparations that African Americans are asking for is not just because we want the federal government to give or the state governments to give something to African Americans, but because of their acts and because of the contributions that the African Americans' ancestors have given to this country, and they deserve, their descendants deserve every bit of that. I mean, the French took reparations from Haiti. I mean, if you want to go back to history, when the French were taking reparations because of them losing the revolution, their war against the Haitian revolutionaries, then demanding Haitians to pay them reparations, which the Haitians did, and continue to pay all the way to the, I think, mid-2000s or so. I don't know if they're still paying it though, but the Haitians paid reparations to the French. And it was in their legal documents termed reparations because of their lost income and all that stuff. So if you look at reparations, reparations is not just free. It's pretty much all the lost income that the slaves should have gotten from the federal government and the states at that time, so that they could also have helped build their descendants' wealth. That is what we are asking for. Reparations is not just a free money. It is the repairing the damage that was done by the federal government and the state governments at that time. So I hope people will understand when the term reparations come about, rather than assuming that reparations is just a matter of government giving money to a certain group of people just because of the government believes that they were wrong with these people, all that stuff. No. Yes, the government might have believed that they were wrong on certain things that was done to these people, but also it is also to repair the acts, the deliberate acts by the government against the African American people and their ancestors and their descendants. So I get it when some people talk about, yes, we want this, we want that, we want this, we want that. But when you have liberal groups, especially liberal groups that are supposed to be part of the coalition of the Democratic Party as well as the African American coalition, to be on the side of African Americans, when they start to oppose the very thing that you would think that they would support to help African American communities, then that becomes a very, 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 very tricky situation. But at the end of the day, I don't know if all this thing will come to be true in terms of the reparations being proposed, or I mean all these legislations and bills that are being looked into and all that stuff. Because I remember the Democratic Congress last year also had a committee that was studying this issue. And then the Democrats lost the House. So basically, the Republicans took over. And apparently, I don't think that committee is even looking into any of that stuff anymore. But hopefully, maybe one day they'll become very serious about it. And then maybe something will be done in terms of reparations. But now, the other question about this issue of reparations is also the criteria. Because there's this group called ADOS, which basically is what we call African American descendants of slaves. It's based, I think, in Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, somewhere. And they have been making arguments that even if America is supposed to pay reparations to the descendants of slaves or black people in America, they have to have a criteria where this reparations only can be received by the descendants of these slaves. Therefore, even though it might say African Americans, African children born in America, as well as African children born who came from Caribbean, should also have the same benefits as the African children with slavery legacy. And they've been making this argument for some time now. And the argument is solely based on that argument that those newly arrival Africans as well as Caribbeans or who just migrated to America, since they don't have slavery ancestries, they also don't have to benefit from anything in regards to reparations. And that's the argument they've been making. And this thing has been going on for some time now. And I mean, I can understand the argument, because they are saying basically that if this is about reparations to repair the damage that was done to the descendants of slaves and all that stuff, then people who just migrated from Africa and other parts of the Caribbean and all that stuff don't deserve to benefit from that reparations. But I don't know what criteria most of these governments are going to use, whether it's going to be based on just being an African American or black person born in America, or it's going to go all the way down to the legacy of slavery. But either way, at the end of the day, reparations is to repair the damage that America did to the enslavement of Africans. And African American descendants of those great ancestors deserved to be repaid for what their ancestors went through. So I'll end here by saying, if it's Sunday, it's the Africa Weekly Talk. God bless you guys. Have a nice week and peace and love.